Imagine one day you were told by a foreign government that you could no longer live in your home, a home your family lived in for thousands of years. After welcoming strangers and trading with them, many of your people were killed by diseases they couldn't fight. That's exactly what happened to the Native Americans in the early history of the United States. It's called removal. When the United States of America became a nation in 1776, Native Americans were not considered part of it. In many ways they were considered separate nations like England or France. It was seen as a way to deal with what people called the Indian problem. Between the American Revolution and the United States Civil War, the U.S. grew rapidly. This rapid expansion brought about conflicts between whites who were settling on lands and Native Americans who lived on lands whites wanted. The policy of the United States was based on the assumption that white settlers should advance and the Indians should withdraw. As one native said, "The white man, they are like blades of grass on the prairie, without number, and the problem is how to survive as a tribe." Once thought of as traders passing through, Europeans were soon seen as settlers who wanted Native American land. How to take these Indian lands presented a problem for the United States, as some of the people wanted to exterminate the natives and others wanted to treat natives with honor. They believed the Native Americans would eventually adopt a new, more American way of life. This type of thought is known as paternalism, the idea that the United States should do what is best for Indians according to white norms. Whites wanted the Indian lands for expanding homes and farms, but also for the valuable things that land offered, such as timber, gold, and lead. Hunger for the new land pressured the American government to develop a policy to claim all Native American lands east of the river Mississippi. The American view of natives as savages, pagans, and pre-Christian, living in a wilderness under rudimentary form of life, brought about this thought. The removal of Native Americans west of the Mississippi to territories set up in present-day Oklahoma was a process that would eventually dissimulate and make extinct all Native American tribes in the United States. The forceful removal process, known as the Indian Removal Act, was pushed through Congress and signed by President Andrew Jackson on May 26, 1830. In the early 1800s, while the rapidly growing United States expanded into the lower South, white settlers faced what they considered an obstacle. This area was home to the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. These Indian nations, in the view of settlers and many other white Americans, were standing in the way of progress. Eager for Native American lands, the settlers pressured the federal government to acquire Indian territory. Andrew Jackson, from Tennessee, was a forceful proponent of Indian removal. In 1814, he commanded the U.S. military forces that defeated a war-hungry faction of the Creek Nation known as the Red Sticks at Horseshoe Bend in present-day Alabama. In their defeat, the Creeks lost 22 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama. The U.S. acquired more land in 1818 when Jackson's troops invaded Spanish Florida, seeking to punish the Seminoles for their practice of harboring fugitive slaves. Between 1814 and 1824, Jackson was instrumental in negotiating 9 of 11 treaties with native tribes in the South which traded off their eastern lands to the U.S. government in exchange for pre-established lands in the West outside of existing U.S. state borders. The tribes agreed to the treaties mainly for strategic purposes. They wanted to please the government in the hopes of retaining some of their land, and they wanted to protect themselves from white harassment from the settlers. As a result of the treaties, the United States gained control over 3/4 of Alabama and Florida, as well as part of Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This was a period of voluntary Indian migration, and only a small number of Creeks, Cherokee, and Choctaw actually moved to the new lands. In 1823, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in Johnson v. McIntosh, which stated that Indians could occupy lands within the United States, but could not hold title to those lands and could not sell those lands to any settlers, only to the U.S. government. This was because their right of occupancy was subordinate to the United States' right of discovery. In response to the great threat this posed, the Creeks, Cherokee, and Chickasaw instituted policies of restricting land sales to the government. They wanted to protect what remained of their land before it was too late. Although the 5 Indian nations made earlier attempts at resistance, many of their strategies were non-violent. One method was to adopt Anglo-American practices such as large-scale farming, Western education, and slaveholding. This earned the nations the designation of the 5 civilized tribes. They adopted this policy of assimilation in an attempt to coexist with settlers and fend off hostility, but it only made whites jealous and resentful. Other attempts involved ceding portions of their land to the United States with a view of retaining control over at least part of their territory or the new territory they received in exchange. Some Indian nations simply refused to leave their land. The Creeks and the Seminoles even waged war to protect their territory. The First Seminole War lasted from 1817 to 1818. The Seminoles were aided by fugitive slaves who had found protection among them and had been living with them for years. The presence of the fugitives enraged white planters and fueled their desire to defeat the Seminoles. The Cherokee used legal means in their attempt to protect their rights. They sought protection from land-hungry white settlers who continually harassed them by stealing their livestock, burning their towns, and squatting on their land. In 1827, the Cherokee adopted a written constitution declaring themselves a sovereign nation. They based this on the United States policy in former treaties that Indian nations had been declared sovereign so they would be legally capable of ceding their lands. Now the Cherokee hoped to use this status to their advantage. The state of Georgia, however, did not recognize their sovereign status, instead viewing natives as tenants living on state land. The Cherokee took their case to the Supreme Court in 1831. They based their appeal on an 1830 Georgia law which prohibited whites from living on Indian territory without a license from the state. The state legislature had written this law to justify removing white missionaries who were helping the Indians resist removal. The court decided in favor of the Cherokee in Worcester versus Georgia. Judge John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee had the right to self-government and declared Georgia's extension of state law over the Cherokee to be unconstitutional. The state of Georgia refused to abide by the court decision, however, and President Jackson refused to enforce the law. In 1830, just 1 year after taking office, Jackson's Indian Removal Act was pushed through Congress. It gave the president the power to negotiate removal treaties with Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi. Under these treaties, the Indians were given up their lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for lands in the west. This act affected not only the southeastern nations, but many other nations in the north. The removal was supposed to be voluntary and peaceful, and it was that way for the tribes that agreed to the conditions. But the southeastern nations resisted, and Jackson forced them to leave. President Jackson's attitude toward Native Americans was paternalistic and patronizing. He described them as children in need of guidance and believed the removal policy was beneficial to the Indians. Most white Americans thought that the United States would never extend beyond the Mississippi. Removal would save Indian people from depredations of whites and would resettle them in an area where they could govern themselves in peace. But some Americans saw this as an excuse for brutal and inhumane course of action and protested loudly against removal. Their protests did not save the southeastern nations from removal, however. The Choctaws were the first to sign a removal treaty in September of 1830. Some chose to stay in Mississippi under the terms of the Removal Act. Although the War Department made some attempts to protect those who stayed, it was no match for the land-hungry whites who squatted on Choctaw territory or cheated them out of their holdings. Soon, most of the remaining Choctaws, tired of mistreatment, sold their land and moved west. For the next 28 years, the United States government struggled to force relocation of the southeastern nations. A small group of Seminoles were coerced into signing a removal treaty in 1833, but the majority of the tribe declared the treaty illegitimate and refused to leave. The resulting struggle was the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1842. As in the First War, fugitive slaves fought beside the Seminoles who had taken them in. Thousands of lives were lost in the war, which cost the Jackson administration 10 times the amount allotted for Indian removal. In the end, most of the Seminoles moved to the new territory. The few who remained had to defend themselves in the Third Seminole War, in which the U.S. military forcefully drove out the remaining Seminoles to western lands. The Creeks also refused to immigrate. They signed a treaty in March 1832 which opened a large portion of their Alabama land to white settlement, but guaranteed them protective ownership under the remaining portion. The government did not protect them from the speculators, however, who quickly cheated them out of their lands. By 1835, the Creeks began stealing livestock and crops from white settlers. Some even committed arson and murder in retaliation for their brutal treatment. In 1836, the Secretary of War ordered the removal of Creeks as a military necessity. By 1837, approximately 15,000 Creeks had migrated west, having never signed a removal treaty. The Chickasaws had seen removal as inevitable and had not resisted. They signed a treaty in 1832 which stated that the federal government would provide them with suitable western land and would protect them until they moved. But once again, the onslaught of white settlers proved too much for the War Department and it backed down on its promise. The Chickasaws were forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their western allotment. They migrated there in the winter of 1837. The Cherokee, on the other hand, were tricked with an illegitimate treaty. In 1833, a small faction agreed to sign the Removal Act. The leaders of this group were not recognized leaders of the Cherokee Nation, and over 15,000 Cherokee, led by Principal Chief John Ross, signed a petition in protest. The Supreme Court ignored their demands and ratified the treaty in 1836. The Cherokee were given 2 years to migrate voluntarily, at the end of which time they would be forcefully removed. By 1838, only 2,000 had migrated. 16,000 remained on their land. The U.S. government sent in 7,000 troops, who forced the Cherokee into stockades at Bayonet Point. They were not allowed time to gather their belongings as whites looted their homes. Then began the terrible march known as the Trail of Tears, in which 4,000, or roughly 1/4 of the Cherokee people, died of cold, hunger, and disease on their way to western lands. By 1837, the Jackson administration had removed 46,000 Native American people from their land east of the Mississippi and had secured treaties which led to the removal of a slightly larger number. Most members of the 5 southeastern nations have been relocated west, opening 25 million acres of land to white settlement under state control. Ultimately, the Indian Removal Act, whether forcibly or voluntarily, removed all Native American tribes west of the Mississippi. The United States government had removed Native Americans from their homelands and set them up in territories outside the borders of the United States. A new era of devastation had begun for the Native American nations, as they were forced to relocate and establish a new way of life foreign to them, which resulted in the general extinction of most Native American tribes.